Welcome to Dreamscribe, your companion on the journey to peaceful sleep. Before you drift off, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps this calming community grow. Where in the world are you tuning in from? The RV rolled into the clearing just as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink. The forest stretched endlessly on either side of the dirt road, its tall trees swaying gently in the evening breeze. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, a content smile on her face as she glanced out at the tranquil scenery. "This is perfect," she said. "Exactly what we needed." Tom, her husband, pulled the RV to a stop in the middle of the clearing. He turned off the engine and stretched, the day's-long drive etched into the lines on his face. "Quiet, peaceful, and off the grid," he said, his tone approving. "No neighbors, no traffic, just us and nature." In the back of the RV, Ellie, their 16-year-old daughter, was glued to her phone. She groaned dramatically as the Wi-Fi signal disappeared, replaced by a glaring no service notification. "This is going to be torture," she muttered, tossing her phone onto the table. "Come on, Ellie," Sarah said, turning to face her. "It'll be good for you to disconnect for a bit. You might actually enjoy it." Max, her younger brother, bounded to the window, his face pressed against the glass. "This place is awesome," he exclaimed. "Look at all the trees. Can we go exploring?" "Tomorrow," Tom said. "Let's get settled in first." As the family stepped out of the RV, the crisp forest air greeted them, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth. Max ran ahead, kicking up fallen leaves as he went. "It's so quiet," Sarah remarked, glancing around. "You can't even hear a bird." Tom shrugged, unloading their camping chairs. "That's the beauty of being out here. It's just us and nature. No distractions." They set up a small campfire near the RV, roasting marshmallows as the sky darkened. The stars began to peek through the canopy above, their brilliance unchallenged by city lights. Ellie sat back in her chair, her earlier annoyance fading as she took in the peaceful scene. Max poked his marshmallow stick into the flame, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Do you think there are animals out there?" he asked, nodding toward the trees. "Probably," Sarah said, smiling. "But they're more afraid of us than we are of them." The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the surrounding trees. The family's laughter echoed through the clearing, a warm reminder of the simple joys of being together. But as the night wore on, the light from the fire began to feel like a fragile barrier against the darkness pressing in. After the fire had burned down to embers, the family climbed into the RV to settle in for the night. Max lingered at the window, staring out at the dark forest. "Mom," he said, his voice hesitant, "was that tree there before?" Sarah paused, glancing over his shoulder. The tree Max was pointing at was large and gnarled, its twisted branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. She frowned. "I'm not sure," she said. "Maybe we just didn't notice it earlier." Max pressed his face closer to the glass. "It's weird," he said. "It looks closer." "Come on, Max," Tom called from the back of the RV, time for bed. "You can look at trees tomorrow." With a reluctant sigh, Max climbed into his bunk. Sarah gave the tree one last glance before drawing the curtain. "It's just your imagination," she whispered to herself, though the unease in her chest lingered. The RV was silent, save for the soft hum of the portable heater. Sarah lay awake in bed, her eyes tracing the patterns on the ceiling. She wasn't sure what had stirred her from sleep, but something felt off. A faint creaking noise reached her ears, like the sound of wood bending under pressure. She sat up slowly, her breath catching. The sound came again, louder this time. It seemed to be coming from outside. Sarah crept to the window and peeked through the curtain. The clearing was bathed in pale moonlight, the trees casting long, jagged shadows across the ground. Everything looked still, but the creaking continued, rhythmic and deliberate, as though the forest itself was breathing. Sarah shivered and let the curtain fall back into place. "It's just the wind," she whispered, trying to convince herself. But deep down, she knew the air outside had been deathly still. The next morning, the family emerged from the RV to find the clearing changed. The forest, once distant, now seemed much closer. The trees that had been on the edge of the clearing yesterday were now just a few feet from the RV. "What the hell?" Tom muttered, rubbing his eyes. "Did we park closer to the trees?" "No," Sarah said firmly. "We parked in the middle of the clearing." "I'm sure of it." Ellie walked a slow circle around the RV, her arms crossed. "Okay, this is officially creepy," she said. "Trees don't just move." Max crouched near one of the new trees, inspecting the bark. "Look," he said, pointing to the ground. "There aren't even roots showing. It's like they grew here overnight." Sarah's unease deepened. Maybe we should pack up and head home, she said. This doesn't feel right. Tom shook his head. Come on, Sarah. It's just trees. We'll be fine. Let's not cut the trip short over nothing. As the day wore on, the family tried to put the strange occurrence out of their minds. They hiked through the forest, exploring trails and marveling at the natural beauty. But even during the daylight, an unshakable feeling of being watched followed them. Max ran ahead on the trail, his laughter ringing through the trees. Wait for us, Sarah called, quickening her pace to catch up. When she rounded the bend, her heart skipped a beat. Max was standing still, staring at a massive tree in the middle of the path. Its bark was twisted and blackened, and its branches were covered in long, thin strands of moss that looked like hair. It wasn't here before, Max said, his voice small. I swear it wasn't. Tom caught up, placing a reassuring hand on Max's shoulder. It's just a tree, buddy, he said, though his own unease was clear in his eyes. Come on, let's keep moving. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the family returned to the RV, their nerves frayed. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was closing in, inch by inch. That night, the creaking noises returned, louder and more insistent. Max refused to sleep, huddling under his blanket with a flashlight clutched in his hand. Ellie sat by the window, watching the dark shapes of the trees swaying gently in the moonlight. She noticed something strange, a tall tree near the RV that seemed to be leaning slightly, its branches almost touching the roof. Mom, she whispered, her voice trembling. That tree wasn't there before. Sarah joined her at the window, her breath catching as she saw the tree. Its trunk was impossibly thick, and its bark seemed to ripple in the faint light, as though it were alive. We're leaving in the morning, Sarah said firmly. No arguments. The family huddled together in the RV, their fear growing as the night stretched on. Outside, the creaking turned into groaning, and the shadows of the trees seemed to grow longer, creeping closer to the RV. This introduction sets the tone for the moving forest, blending tranquility with an escalating sense of dread. It hooks viewers with eerie, atmospheric details and foreshadows the forest's sinister intentions. Let me know if you'd like to expand or adjust any part. The morning sun rose sluggishly, its light muted by the thick canopy of leaves overhead. What little light filtered through was dappled, casting intricate patterns on the ground that shifted with a faint breeze. The once tranquil clearing where the RV was parked now felt suffocating, as though the forest had closed in overnight. Sarah stood at the edge of the RV, her arms crossed tightly as she surveyed the dense ring of trees that now surrounded them. Does it seem closer to you? She asked Tom, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't want to alarm Max and Ellie, who were still inside the RV. Tom squinted at the treeling, his brow furrowed. Maybe, he said, or maybe we're just imagining things. Trees don't move, Sarah. But even as he said it, he couldn't shake the nagging sensation that the clearing had shrunk. The forest, which had seemed so serene the day before, now loomed like a living entity, its dark shadows pooling ominously between the trunks. The forest wasn't silent, but its sounds were off. Instead of the usual symphony of chirping birds and rustling leaves, there was a faint, rhythmic creaking that echoed through the trees. It was as if the forest itself were stretching and groaning, shifting just beyond the family's sight. Sarah walked a few steps toward the nearest tree, her boots crunching on the damp forest floor. The bark was gnarled and rough, with deep grooves that looked almost like scars. She ran her fingers over the surface and pulled back sharply. It was cold and damp, as though the tree had been crying. A chill ran down her spine. Tom, she called softly, gesturing for him to join her. Look at this. Tom approached, frowning. It's just a tree, Sarah, he said, though he couldn't help but notice the odd texture of the bark. It felt wrong, unnatural. From the RV, Max's voice called out, Mom, Dad, there's something weird over here. Sarah and Tom hurried back to the RV, where Max was crouched near the rear of the vehicle, pointing at the ground. What is it, buddy? Tom asked, crouching down beside him. Max pointed to a series of small roots snaking their way toward the RV's tires. They were thin and pale, almost like veins, and they hadn't been there the day before. Are they growing? Sarah asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. Tom grabbed a stick and prodded one of the roots. It snapped easily, using a dark, sap-like substance that smelled faintly of iron. He recoiled, wiping his hand on his pants. What the hell is this? Ellie stepped out of the RV, her phone in hand. Okay, I know I said I hate it here, but now I really hate it here, she said, snapping a picture of the roots. This place is seriously messed up. After breakfast, the family decided to explore the area, hoping to shake off the unease that had settled over them. But the more they walked, the stranger the forest became. The familiar paths from the day before now twisted and turned in ways that didn't make sense. Landmarks they'd passed, like a fallen log or a cluster of wildflowers, had disappeared, replaced by new features that seemed to have sprung up overnight. "Are we lost?" Max asked, clutching Sarah's hand tightly. "We're not lost," Sarah said, though her voice lacked conviction. "We just need to retrace our steps." Tom pulled out his compass, but the needle spun erratically, refusing to settle on a direction. "That's not normal," he muttered, shaking it as though that would fix the issue. Ellie rolled her eyes, though her face was pale. "This whole place isn't normal," she said. "Can we just go back to the RV?" On their way back, Max spotted something glinting in the underbrush. He tugged on Sarah's sleeve and pointed. "What's that?" Sarah knelt down and brushed away the leaves, revealing a rusted, weathered sign half buried in the dirt. The words were barely legible, but they could make out the faint phrase, "Do not stay after dark." "What the hell is this doing here?" Tom asked, his unease deepening. Ellie took a step back, glancing nervously at the surrounding trees. "Let's just go," she said. "I don't want to find out what it means." The family hurried back to the RV, the sense of being watched growing with every step. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches forming an almost impenetrable canopy that blocked out the sun. By the time they reached the RV, the sky was already darkening. The clearing, once bathed in warm sunlight, now felt cold and unwelcoming. The fire pit they'd used the night before was surrounded by fallen branches, as though the forest had crept closer while they were gone. Tom busied himself with trying to start the RV's engine, but it sputtered and died, refusing to turn over. "Battery's dead," he said, frustration evident in his voice. "I checked it yesterday. It was fine." Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder, her face pale. "Do you think?" she began, but she couldn't bring herself to finish the thought. Ellie and Max sat inside the RV, their eyes glued to the windows. "They're closer," Max whispered, pointing at the trees. "They're right there." That night, the family huddled inside the RV, every creak and groan of the forest sending shivers down their spines. The once distant creaking noises were now right outside, accompanied by the faint sound of leaves brushing against the metal exterior. Sarah peered out the window, her heart pounding. The trees were unmistakably closer, their branches nearly touching the RV. One tree in particular stood out. It was massive, its trunk twisted and blackened, with gnarled roots that seemed to pulse faintly in the moonlight. "What do they want?" Ellie whispered, her voice trembling. Tom shook his head, his jaw tight. "They're just trees," he said, though his tone was far from convincing. "They can't hurt us." But as the night stretched on, it became clear that the forest wasn't just a passive observer. The RV shuddered as roots snaked up its sides, the groaning of wood punctuated by what sounded like faint whispers. The family huddled together, their fear mounting as the forest seemed to close in around them. This section creates an immersive atmosphere, blending detailed descriptions of the forest's eerie transformation with the family's growing unease. Let me know if you'd like refinements or to proceed with the next section. The RV's small interior was tense, filled with the low hum of whispered speculation and unspoken fear. Outside, the forest stood still, its encroaching presence undeniable. The trees, which had once seemed distant and scattered, were now close enough to cast shadows on the RV's windows. Their gnarled branches reached toward the vehicle like grasping fingers. Ellie paced back and forth in the narrow aisle, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "We need to leave," she said, her voice strained. "Like right now." Tom sat at the dining table, his head resting in his hands. "I'm trying," he said through gritted teeth. "The engine won't start, and the battery's dead. I don't know what else to do." Max sat by the window, his small hands pressed against the glass. "They're closer," he whispered, his breath fogging the pain. "I think they're watching us." Sarah knelt beside him, her hand on his shoulder. "It's just the wind," she said softly, though her trembling voice betrayed her words. "Trees don't watch people, Max." "They do here," Max muttered, his wide eyes fixed on a particularly large tree with a twisted trunk. The night deepened, and with it came new sounds. The groaning of wood was louder now, accompanied by the distinct creak of branches shifting. It was a sound that made the hair on the back of Sarah's neck stand on end, like the forest itself was stretching and straining to get closer. Ellie stopped pacing, her attention drawn to the scratches on the RV's door. "Were those there before?" she asked, pointing. The deep, jagged marks ran parallel to each other, as though something had clawed at the metal. Tom got up to inspect them, his brow furrowing. "No," he said firmly. "They weren't. What made them?" Ellie asked. "It's not like trees can scratch doors. Probably just an animal," Tom said, though even he didn't sound convinced. The radio crackled to life suddenly, filling the RV with a burst of static. The family froze, their eyes snapping to the small device mounted on the dashboard. Slowly, the static gave way to a faint, distorted voice. "You shouldn't have stayed." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. What did it just say? Tom leaned closer, his hand hovering over the radio. "It's just interference," he said, though his voice shook. "Old radios pick up weird signals sometimes." "Play it again," Ellie said. "Turn it back on." Tom hesitated before twisting the knob. The radio sputtered and hissed, but the voice didn't return. The static grew louder, almost deafening, before the radio abruptly went silent again. As the hours dragged on, the family's unease turned to outright fear. The trees had drawn even closer, their roots now visible just outside the RV's windows. Max pointed to one of the branches, which seemed to be pressing against the glass. "It's touching the RV," he said, his voice trembling. Tom grabbed a flashlight and opened the door, stepping outside despite Sarah's protests. The cool night air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and rotting wood. He swept the beam of light across the clearing, his stomach churning as he saw how much smaller it had become. The forest had closed in on them completely, leaving only a narrow strip of open ground around the RV. "This isn't possible," Tom muttered, his voice barely audible. "Trees don't move." A loud crack echoed through the clearing, and Tom spun around, the flashlight shaking in his hand. One of the larger trees seemed to lean forward, its branches brushing against the top of the RV. He stumbled back inside, slamming the door shut behind him. "We're not safe here," he said, his face pale. "We need to find a way out." The family gathered around the dining table, their voices hushed. "We can't stay here," Sarah said firmly. "If the RV won't start, we'll have to leave on foot." "And go where?" Ellie asked, her tone sharp. "The forest is everywhere. We don't even know which way to go." "There was a trail we passed yesterday," Sarah said. "If we can find it, maybe it'll lead us out." Tom nodded reluctantly. "Fine. We'll pack some supplies and head out at first light. But we need to stick together. No one wanders off, no matter what." Max looked up from his spot at the table, his face pale. "What if the trees don't let us leave?" The question hung in the air, unanswerable and terrifying. That night, the whispers started. At first, they were faint, barely discernible above the groaning of the trees. But as the hours passed, they grew louder, filling the RV with an eerie chorus of overlapping voices. Sarah lay in bed, her heart racing. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, urgent, pleading, and filled with sorrow. She got up and crept to the window, peeking through the curtain. The trees were closer than ever, their branches now intertwined above the RV, forming a canopy that blocked out the stars. The whispers grew louder, and for a moment, Sarah thought she saw something moving between the trees, dark shapes that flitted in and out of the shadows. She backed away from the window, her breathing shallow. "Tom," she whispered, shaking him awake. "There's something out there." He sat up groggily, but the whispers immediately snapped him to attention. "What is that?" he asked, his voice low. "I don't know," Sarah said, "but it's getting closer." As dawn approached, the family prepared to leave. They packed what they could carry, flashlights, food, and a map that now felt useless. Tom opened the door cautiously, his eyes scanning the clearing. The trees were so close now that the RV was nearly boxed in. The whispers had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. The forest seemed to be waiting. Max clutched Sarah's hand tightly as they stepped outside. "I don't like this," he said. "It feels like we're being watched." Ellie nodded, her face pale. "It's like the forest knows we're trying to leave." Tom led the way, his flashlight cutting through the dim light. The family moved in a tight group, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of fallen leaves. Every crack of a twig and rustle of leaves made them jump, their fear mounting with every step. As they reached the edge of the clearing, Sarah froze. A large tree blocked the path, its roots spread wide and its trunk twisted. The bark was marked with deep grooves that formed a strange, almost human-like face. "It wasn't here before," she said, her voice shaking. The whispers returned, louder than ever, and the family huddled together as the forest seemed to close in around them. Underscore 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 underscore. This section heightens the tension, blending supernatural elements with the family's escalating fear. The forest's malevolence becomes more apparent, setting the stage for the story's climactic moment. Let me know if you'd like refinements or to proceed with the next section. The forest was alive. That much was clear now. The trees weren't just growing, they were moving, thinking, and reacting. As the family stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, surrounded by an encroaching wall of bark and branches, the whispers reached a deafening crescendo. It was as if the forest was trying to speak, its voice fractured and scattered across 1,000 ancient timbers. "We're trapped," Ellie said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her gaze darted between the towering trunks, each one seeming to lean closer. "There's no way out." Tom turned in a slow circle, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "There has to be," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "We can't stay here." Sarah pulled Max close, her arms wrapped protectively around him. "What does it want?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why is this happening?" From deep within the forest, a low, guttural creaking sound reverberated. The ground beneath their feet seemed to pulse in response, as though the earth itself was alive. Then came the sound of splintering wood, and a path began to open before them, the trees shifting aside to reveal a narrow trail. "It's leading us somewhere," Max said, clutching his mother's hand tightly. "No way," Ellie said, shaking her head. "We're not following that. It's a trap." "We don't have a choice," Tom said grimly. "We can't stay here, and we can't go back." The family moved cautiously down the path, their flashlights casting jittery beams of light across the forest floor. The trees pressed in on either side, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sky. The air grew colder with each step, the whispers now replaced by an eerie, rhythmic rustling that seemed to follow them. "Where is it taking us?" Sarah whispered, her breath visible in the frigid air. Tom didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the trail ahead, where the path seemed to dip into a hollow. The trees grew denser as they descended, their trunks covered in a thick layer of moss that glowed faintly in the dark. Ellie stopped abruptly, her flashlight beam catching something on one of the trees. "Wait," she said. "Look at this." The bark of the tree was etched with symbols, intricate carvings that pulsed faintly with a green light. The patterns seemed to shift and writhe as she stared at them, forming shapes that were almost recognizable. "What is it?" Max asked, his voice small. Sarah knelt beside Ellie, running her fingers over the carvings. "They're warnings," she said, her voice trembling. "Or instructions." Tom stepped closer, his flashlight illuminating more of the symbols. "They're everywhere," he said, his voice tight. "On every tree." The path ended abruptly at the mouth of a massive hollow. The ground sloped downward into a cavernous space, where the trees seemed to grow directly out of the earth in twisted, unnatural shapes. The air was thick with the smell of damp soil and decay. In the center of the hollow stood a massive tree, its trunk blackened and scarred. Its roots spread out in all directions, weaving through the earth like veins. At its base, a faint green light pulsed rhythmically, casting eerie shadows across the cavern walls. Max clung to Sarah, his eyes wide with fear. "That's it," he said. "That's what's been watching us." The tree seemed to breathe, its branches swaying without wind. The whispers returned, louder and more distinct, emanating from the hollow itself. Words began to form, their meaning chillingly clear. "Join us." Ellie stepped back, shaking her head. "No," she said, her voice trembling. "We're not doing this." Tom moved forward cautiously, his flashlight trained on the pulsing light. "What does it want?" he muttered. "Why is it doing this?" Sarah pointed to the carvings on the nearby trees. "The symbols," she said. "They're trying to tell us something." As Sarah studied the carvings, their meaning became clearer. The forest demanded a balance, a payment for trespassing on its sacred ground. The carvings told the story of others who had come before, travelers who had ignored the signs, who had stayed too long. Each had been claimed by the forest, their souls absorbed into the ancient tree at the center of the hollow. "We have to leave," Ellie said, her voice rising. "We have to go now." "We can't," Sarah said, her hands trembling. "They won't let us." "Not without," she trailed off, her eyes darting to the symbols. "Not without a sacrifice." Tom's face hardened. "No," he said firmly. "We're not giving it anything." Max clung to Sarah, his voice trembling. "Mom, I don't want to stay here." Sarah pulled him close, her heart breaking. "You won't," she said. "I promise." As if sensing their defiance, the forest erupted into motion. The trees around the hollow groaned and twisted, their branches lashing out like whips. Roots burst from the ground, snaking toward the family with terrifying speed. "Run!" Tom shouted, grabbing Sarah's hand and pulling her toward the path. The family sprinted back the way they had come, the forest closing in around them. The roots clawed at their feet, and the branches reached down from above, blocking their path. The whispers grew deafening, a cacophony of voices screaming for them to stop. Ellie stumbled, her flashlight tumbling to the ground. Tom doubled back, grabbing her arm and pulling her to her feet. "Keep moving," he shouted. The green light from the hollow grew brighter, spilling out onto the path. It illuminated the carvings on the trees, which now glowed fiercely, their meaning impossible to ignore. One must stay. The family reached the edge of the clearing, their breaths ragged. The RV stood just ahead, its windows fogged from the cold. But the forest wasn't done with them. The trees closed ranks, forming an impenetrable wall around the vehicle. Sarah turned to Tom, her eyes filled with tears. "It's not going to let us go," she said. "Not all of us." Tom shook his head. "There has to be another way," he said. "There has to be." "There isn't," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "We have to make a choice." Max clung to her leg, his face buried in her side. "Don't let them take me," he sobbed. "Please, Mom." Sarah knelt down, holding him tightly. "They won't," she said. "I promise." Tom stepped forward, his expression resolute. "I'll do it," he said. "I'll stay." "No," Sarah cried, grabbing his arm. "You can't. We need you. You need to get the kids out of here," Tom said. "I'll keep the forest distracted. Just go." As Tom stepped toward the trees, the forest seemed to pause, its movements slowing as though considering his offer. The green light dimmed slightly, and the whispers quieted to a low murmur. "Take me," Tom said, his voice steady. "Let them go." The tree at the center of the hollow groaned, its branches stretching toward the sky. The roots that had been chasing the family receded, and the wall of trees around the RV began to part. Sarah grabbed Max and Ellie, her tears streaming down her face. "We'll come back for you," she said. "I swear." Tom turned to her, his expression soft. "Just go," he said. "Get them somewhere safe." As the RV roared to life, Sarah looked back one last time. Tom stood at the edge of the hollow, his figure silhouetted against the pulsing green light. The trees closed around him, their branches swallowing him whole. The family drove away in silence, the forest disappearing into the distance. But the whispers stayed with them, faint and haunting, a reminder of the sacrifice that had been made. Max clutched Sarah's hand tightly, his eyes wide with fear. "Will it follow us?" he asked. Sarah didn't answer. She couldn't. The forest had taken what it wanted, for now. As the RV disappeared over the horizon, a single tree sprouted in the middle of the road, its bark marked with fresh carvings. One must stay. This climactic section reveals the forest's horrifying truth, while pushing the family to their emotional and physical limits. The tension builds to a devastating choice, leaving lingering questions and an unsettling sense of doom. Let me know if further adjustments are needed. The RV's engine roared as Sarah gripped the wheel, her knuckles white and her breath shallow. Behind them, the forest came alive, its trees groaning and twisting as if in pain. Massive roots erupted from the ground, tearing through the clearing and blocking the narrow paths that led back to safety. "Hold on!" Sarah shouted, her voice cracking as she swerved to avoid a falling branch that smashed onto the dirt road. Inside the RV, Max clung to Ellie, tears streaming down his face. Ellie tightened her grip on him, her eyes darting to the windows where shadows flickered and danced. "Mom, it's coming!" Ellie screamed, pointing to the rear window. Through the foggy glass, they could see it, the ancient tree from the hollow. Its massive trunk moved like a slithering serpent, its roots spreading outward in every direction. The pulsing green light at its core illuminated the path behind them, casting eerie, shifting shadows on the RV's interior. Tom stood by the passenger seat, his jaw set. "We have to keep moving," he said. "Don't stop, no matter what happens." As the RV sped down the dirt road, the trees closed in around them, their branches intertwining to form a nearly impenetrable wall. Roots snaked out from the ground, lashing at the tires and scraping against the undercarriage. Sarah swerved violently, barely managing to keep the RV on the narrow road. "We can't outrun it," she shouted. "It's everywhere." Tom scanned the forest ahead, his mind racing. "There's got to be a way out," he said. "A weak point, something we can break through." Ellie pointed ahead, her voice frantic. There, the path splits. Sarah veered toward the left fork, the RV bouncing violently as it tore through the uneven terrain. The forest seemed to scream in response, the sound a deafening mix of creaking wood and howling wind. The ancient tree followed, its massive roots tearing through the earth as it pursued them. "Look out!" Tom yelled, pointing to a massive root that had burst through the road ahead. Sarah yanked the wheel to the right, sending the RV skidding dangerously close to the edge of a ravine. The tires spun wildly, kicking up dirt and rocks as the vehicle struggled to regain traction. "Mom, we're gonna fall!" Max cried, clutching Ellie's arm. "We're not falling!" Sarah snapped, her voice filled with determination. She gunned the engine, and the RV lurched forward, narrowly avoiding the ravine as it climbed back onto solid ground. Tom looked back, his face pale. "It's still coming," he said. "We need to slow it down." "How?" Sarah demanded, her eyes darting between the road and the massive tree that loomed behind them. Tom grabbed a gas canister from the storage compartment. "We'll use fire," he said. "It's afraid of fire." Tom climbed to the back of the RV, bracing himself against the walls as the vehicle jolted and swayed. He poured gasoline into an empty glass bottle, stuffing a rag into the opening. With shaking hands, he lit the makeshift Molotov cocktail and threw it out the rear window. The bottle shattered against one of the pursuing roots, igniting it in a burst of flame. The tree recoiled, its glowing core flickering as the fire spread along its roots. The forest shrieked, the sound so loud and piercing that Sarah had to cover her ears. "It's working!" Ellie shouted, her face lighting up with hope. But the victory was short-lived. The flames sputtered out quickly, smothered by the forest's dampness. The ancient tree surged forward, more aggressive than before, its massive branches slamming into the ground on either side of the RV. The road narrowed ahead, blocked by a massive thicket of trees. Their trunks were intertwined, forming a solid wall that seemed impossible to break through. "We're trapped," Sarah cried, slamming on the brakes. The RV skidded to a stop, the tires kicking up a cloud of dust. Tom jumped out of the RV, flashlight in hand. "We have to clear a path," he said, running toward the thicket. He pulled a hatchet from the emergency kit, hacking at the branches with desperate ferocity. The forest retaliated. Roots shot out from the ground, wrapping around Tom's legs and dragging him backward. He screamed, slashing at the roots with the hatchet as they tightened their grip. "Tom!" Sarah yelled, rushing to help him. She grabbed his arm, pulling with all her strength. Ellie and Max joined her, their combined efforts finally freeing him from the forest's grasp. "We don't have much time," Tom gasped, his face pale. "It's trying to keep us here." As the ancient tree closed in, its glowing core pulsing faster, Sarah made a split-second decision. "Ellie, take Max and get inside the RV," she said. "Tom and I will handle this." "No," Ellie protested. "We're not leaving you out here. Go!" Sarah shouted, her tone leaving no room for argument. Reluctantly, Ellie pulled Max into the RV, slamming the door behind them. Sarah and Tom turned back to the thicket, their faces set with grim determination. "We need a bigger fire," Tom said. "Something that will keep it back long enough for us to break through." Sarah nodded, her mind racing. She grabbed a canister of kerosene from the storage compartment and began dousing the thicket. Tom lit a match, his hands trembling as he held it over the soaked branches. "Do it," Sarah said. Tom dropped the match, and the thicket erupted into flames. The fire roared, its heat intense enough to force them to step back. The forest screamed in rage, the ancient tree recoiling as its roots writhed in pain. "Now!" Tom yelled, grabbing the hatchet and hacking at the weakened branches. Sarah joined him, their combined efforts finally creating a gap large enough for the RV to pass through. Tom and Sarah sprinted back to the RV, their lungs burning from the smoke. Sarah jumped into the driver's seat, slamming the door behind her. "Hold on," she shouted as she floored the accelerator. The RV barreled through the gap in the thicket, the flames licking at its sides. The ancient tree let out one final, deafening scream as the vehicle burst through to the other side. For a moment, everything was still. The forest fell silent, its oppressive presence lifting as the RV sped down the open road. The green light from the ancient tree faded into the distance, swallowed by the darkness. Inside the RV, the family sat in stunned silence, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Max clung to Ellie, his small body trembling. Sarah gripped the wheel tightly, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Did we make it?" Ellie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom nodded slowly, though his expression remained grim. "For now," he said, "but I don't think it's over." Sarah glanced in the rearview mirror, her heart sinking as she saw a single, gnarled tree standing at the edge of the road. Its twisted branches reached toward the sky, and its bark was etched with fresh carvings. One must stay. This climax delivers intense action, high stakes, and emotional moments as the family fights to escape the forest's grasp. Let me know if you'd like refinements or to proceed with the next section. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, bathed in the pale light of dawn. Inside the RV, the family sat in exhausted silence, their bodies battered and their minds reeling. Sarah gripped the steering wheel tightly, her eyes fixed on the road as though afraid it might disappear beneath her tires. Her knuckles were white, her breath shallow. "We're out," Ellie whispered from the back seat, though her voice wavered as if she couldn't quite believe it. "We made it." Tom sat in the passenger seat, his gaze distant. His hands trembled slightly as he clenched and unclenched them, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. "Did we, though?" he muttered, his words barely audible over the hum of the RV's engine. Max, curled up against Ellie, clutched a blanket tightly to his chest. His wide eyes scanned the passing trees, every shadow and branch a potential threat. "What if it follows us?" he asked, his voice trembling. "What if it's not over?" Sarah glanced at him in the rearview mirror, her heart breaking at the fear etched into his young face. "It's over," she said, though the words felt hollow. "We're safe now." As the RV sped down the highway, the scenery outside began to change. The trees that lined the road grew denser, their branches arching overhead to form a canopy that blotted out the morning light. The air grew cooler, and a faint, familiar creaking sound echoed through the stillness. Ellie noticed it first. "Mom," she said, her voice tight, "look at the trees." Sarah's grip on the wheel tightened as she followed Ellie's gaze. The trees were unmistakably similar to those in the forest they had just escaped, gnarled, ancient, and covered in faint, glowing carvings. Her pulse quickened as the realization sank in. "We're still in it," Tom said, his voice grim. "We didn't escape. Let us go for now." Max buried his face in Ellie's shoulder, his small body trembling. "I don't want to go back," he whimpered. "Please don't let it take us back." Sarah shook her head, determination hardening her features. "We're not going back," she said. "Whatever this is, we'll find a way to end it." As they drove, the road narrowed, and the trees pressed closer. Just as the tension in the RV reached its breaking point, they came across a figure standing in the middle of the highway. Sarah slammed on the brakes, the RV screeching to a halt mere feet from the person. The figure was an old woman, draped in tattered robes that fluttered in an unseen breeze. Her face was deeply lined, her eyes bright and piercing. She held a staff carved from twisted wood, its surface etched with the same glowing symbols that marked the trees. "Who are you?" Sarah called, stepping out of the RV cautiously. The others stayed inside, watching anxiously through the windows. The woman tilted her head, a faint smile playing on her lips. "You've wandered where you shouldn't have," she said, her voice low and melodic. "The forest does not forgive trespassers." "We didn't mean to trespass," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "We just want to go home." The woman's smile faded. "The forest doesn't care for intentions," she said. "It cares only for balance. A debt has been paid, but its hunger is eternal." Tom stepped out of the RV, his expression wary. "What does it want?" he asked. "What can we do to stop it?" The woman studied him for a moment before tapping her staff against the ground. A faint ripple spread through the air, and a small, glowing orb appeared in her hand. "Take this," she said, holding it out to Sarah. "It is a fragment of the forest's heart. As long as you carry it, you will be able to walk free." Sarah hesitated before taking the orb. It was warm to the touch, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. "What's the catch?" she asked. The woman's gaze darkened. "The forest does not forget," she said. "It will watch you, and if you stray too close again, it will not let you leave." With that, the woman turned and vanished into the trees, leaving the family alone on the empty highway. The RV rolled forward once more, the tension inside palpable. Sarah placed the orb on the dashboard, its faint glow casting eerie shadows across the interior. No one spoke, the weight of the woman's warning hanging heavily over them. Max broke the silence first. "Do you think she was telling the truth?" he asked, his voice small. "I don't know," Sarah admitted, "but we're not taking any chances. We'll stay far away from any forest from now on." Ellie nodded, her eyes fixed on the glowing orb. "It's still out there," she said, waiting. Days passed, and the family slowly began to recover from their ordeal. They avoided wooded areas, sticking to open highways and busy towns. But no matter how far they traveled, the feeling of being watched never truly left them. One evening, as they parked the RV at a roadside motel, Sarah noticed something strange. A single tree stood in the motel's parking lot, gnarled, ancient, and unmistakably marked with glowing carvings. Her heart sank as she realized what it meant. "It followed us," she whispered. Tom joined her, his face pale. "What do we do?" he asked. Sarah's gaze hardened as she looked at the tree. "We keep moving," she said, "and we don't stop until we find a way to end this." The camera pans out as the family drives away, the lone tree standing sentinel in the parking lot. As the RV disappears into the distance, faint whispers rise on the wind, carrying a chilling promise: the forest never forgets. This resolution ties up the immediate conflict, while leaving a lingering sense of dread and mystery. It balances hope with foreboding, ensuring the story's impact lingers with viewers. Let me know if further adjustments are needed.